Thanks, Mo. So, Napoleon's Eagles, guys, let me explain to you before we begin what it's not. This is not Napoleonic up front. This is not a heavy duty, deep dive into Napoleonic warfare. Okay. It is a what we would call a beer and pretzels game. It's very quick, it's very easy, it's fun, but don't go into this if you're like a Napoleonic fanatic going, I looked at the eighth corps here and why is it strength 13? It's not that type of game. It's just a fun little simple game. Let's go ahead and talk about the cards in the game. And then I'm going to do a sample combat and then we're just going to play because that's the best way to learn this game. So before we talk about the cards, let's talk about the actual mat that you're going to use. And this is an open game. You just play it on a table. But there can be, in this game, there's just one wing. You can have multiple wings. In the wing, you have a front line, which you can see here is the VI Corps, the 8 Corps for the Russians, and the 1st and 3rd Division for the French. They're in the front line. Anybody that's close to that front line is in the front line. Then you also have a reserve. You can have multiple front lines. Each wing can have a front line. Each wing can have a reserve. To the left, you keep your deck of cards that you'll use, which is kind of the engine that drives it. And I'm looking over here at the green Napoleon Eagles card. That's the Russian deck, and the French have their own deck. There's a demoralization to keep track of to the left. There's a Oars to Combat card. Occasionally, units will be knocked out for a turn, maybe more, and you put them on that Oars to Combat card. And then there's the turn card. Now we'll move on to the actual cards. There's basically 3 different types of cards. There is the brown card, this Chevradino Redoubt is a terrain card. Then there's leader cards. And then there are units. And there's different types of units. And what we'll do is we'll go through a quick talking about the cards. So we'll start with the terrain cards. There's 2 of them here. I'm going to zoom up just a little bit so we can see them because I'm going to be bouncing back and forth between them. In the game, there's I think 5 scenarios in the game, and each scenario has its own terrain cards. And the terrain cards will actually be passed back and forth between the 2 sides depending on if you capture that terrain. But the terrain cards themselves have a strength on them. Chevradino Redoubt has a strength of 6. Lieberwolkwitz has an 8. I'm sorry, guys, I'm horrible at pronunciation. They also have a little identifier right beneath the strength. You'll see it. It's a little house here. And on Lieberwolkwitz, it's a little black with swords. We'll see that being used when we play the game. Down at the bottom, these are extra stuff that it can be given to you. So like the Chevradino Redoubt, you get an extra artillery, 1 artillery. You'll notice at the bottom, it has a manpower, initiative, and aces up boxes. There's nothing in there, which means you don't get any benefits. But if you look over here on Lieberwolkwitz, it does have a ability in the aces up box. And basically that means when you flip over a card that's an ace, you can turn that ace to a 10. Also in the upper right, it has a 10 with crossed swords. And that means that you can also use this as a melee card, and we'll explain that during combat. They do have flip sides, and when they flip, they lose some stuff. You'll notice that it has stuff at the bottom, but when it flips, it doesn't. And pretty much what that means, and you'll notice it has a white arrow. That white arrow means you've left that terrain, kind of. And the black crossed swords means you're in that terrain, so you get some benefits. Anyway, that's the terrain cards. Let's talk about the leader cards. And normally there's 1 or 2. There's sometimes terrain on both sides. The scenarios will tell you how to set up, by the way. It's pretty easy to do. The leader cards have up to 4 different abilities on them. We'll start with the one on the far right. The 2 in the kind of folded up little form there, that's an orders. That is how many extra cards you can give if you're in the reserve. So your units can either be in the front line or in the reserve. The leader, like this guy, if he's in the reserve, he can give 2 orders to everybody or give basically 2 extra cards during combat. But there's also a leadership value, which also gives 2 extra cards. They do not stack. It's either one or the other. So you might ask yourself, well, why would you use leadership as opposed to the orders? If you're in the front line, you use leaderships. If you're in the reserve, you use orders. If you're in the front line, you can use the other two abilities too. Like there's an initiative ability and an aces up ability. You can use those only from the front line, can't use them from the reserve. So if Prince Bear is in the front line, he can use his leadership to give him two extra cards. He can also use his initiative. And what that initiative does is it changes any of the cards to red. He could take a black card and change it to a red card. A red card, they're already red. He doesn't need to. He has an aces up ability, which means if there's any aces in your hand, he changes those to tens. The downside to being in the front line is before every battle, you basically flip some cards to see if your leader dies. So sometimes it might be better to leave them in a reserve. He can still give you two extra cards, but can't use his special abilities. So Marat, he has the same thing. He has three abilities. Notice he doesn't have an orders, so he needs to be in the front line. His leadership is 2. It gives him two extra cards. His initiative will skip for a second. His ace is up. Any ace card he turns into a 15, but because of the cross muskets there, that means he also turns it into a melee card. Melee cards are very powerful. His initiative is interesting. It has a black and a red in there. So he can turn any card into a black or a red card. He could turn a red card black, a black card red. But it has an asterisk on it. And his asterisk says his initiative is only in effect when he's attacking. When he's defending, he can't use that. Napoleon's the only one in the game right now. Napoleon actually has an initiative that's red-black with no asterisk. So he can turn any card into any color, and that's going to be important. That's it for leaders. Then after leaders, you have unit cards. But a unit card has a strength up there. And then at the bottom, it could have manpower, initiative, and aces. Manpower just adds to your attack value. So this guy adds a 3 to his attack value. The strength is used for defense. Basically, it's how you do damage. Okay. You'll notice there are different symbols. And on the first and third divisions card here, there's an infantry symbol and an artillery symbol. There's also, and you'll see it on this first cavalry corps, a cavalry symbol. But there's actually two different types of cavalry symbols. There's cavalry by itself, and then if I go over here and look at 4 corps, it has a round artillery. It just means there's inherent artillery with them. And that's important when they charge, and I'll show you why later. It's important when you're in battle that you have one of each of these 3 symbols. If you do, it's called combined arms, and you get 1 extra card in battle. So like in this case, 4 corps by itself has an infantry and artillery and a cavalry, so he gets an extra card. Notice over here, like on 1st Cavalry Corps, he has an aces up ability. He can turn any ace into a 13. The Imperial Guard, which is the best unit in the game, strength is 15. He has an infantry symbol. We'll skip the guy next to him for a second. His manpower is 3. By himself, he can turn any card into red or black. He also has an aces up ability. He turns an ace card into a 25. It's also a melee card. He also has a little ability on the right called guard. And I'll actually let you read that in the manual, but it gives you special abilities. There are some special abilities there on page 11. It has a list of what all those symbols mean. The only one we're really concerned with, the infantry, the artillery, and by the way, the artillery also has a number which tells you how many artillery. And then this one has a little horn with I don't know what that is, a star thingy. What that means is he can rally in place. Normally when you rally, you have to be in the reserve. He can rally in the actual front line. That's it for the cards that you fight with. Now we'll talk about your deck of cards. These are the main drivers of the game, is these cards. I'm going to separate them out here. There is a deck. Your deck has cards that range from ace, which is a 1 normally, up to 25. And there's very few 25s and 20s, but there's a lot of the smaller numbers. You use those in battle. They also have a color, and that's important in battle too. The colors are red and black. Okay, so in battle, you just look at the number and the color. Nothing else on the card in battle. However, you do use the cards for other stuff, and I'll bump up and let you look at this red 6 here. If you were firing artillery, and everybody does that at the first, right before combat, you flip over a card and you look at the artillery box. You count up the number of artillery pieces you have on your side, and then you compare it to this box here. And that box is different on every card. Depending on how much artillery you have, it'll tell you whether you do damage or not. Now, the damage from a artillery is a little different than regular damage, and you can look on page 8 of the manual, and it kind of tells you what. And we'll go through that when we go through the actual playthrough, because you'll see, because I'm sure we'll have artillery hit. If you charge with your cavalry, you flip over a card and you look at the charge box, and that tells you what happens to that unit. Like in this case, if it was a regular cavalry unit, it would retreat. If it was an inherent cavalry, it would exhaust that card and it would disrupt it. And I'll show you that in a second. If you do a breakthrough, which means you kill everybody on the other side, you break through that wing, you flip over a card and you compare it to that breakthrough box. At the beginning of a turn, I told you people are going to go to that Hors de Combat card. At the beginning of a turn, you can flip over a card for everybody in there, and you flip it over and look at the recovery box, and it tells you what happens to that person. So here, if there was somebody in the Hors de Combat box, and you flipped over this card, it would disrupt it and move it to the friendly reserve. The last thing that we use there's two other things we use this card for. When you're disrupted, and I'm going to go back over here for just a second and look at a unit. Units can be exhausted, which means they flip sideways. That happens under certain circumstances. If you're exhausted twice, you get disrupted. Disrupted, everything is a little bit less. So I'm going to go ahead and rally him. He's pretty strong there. When he's disrupted, his strength goes down to 7. His manpower goes down to 1. If you're disrupted twice, you're killed. When you're disrupted, you can actually rally yourself and come back to full strength. But you can only rally when you're in your reserve. So that means that during your next movement phase, you're going to have to move a guy back to his reserve. Let me disrupt him there. Then during the start of the next turn, you can try to rally him. Rallying in the game is very easy. You just flip a card. If it's red, you're rallied. If it's black, you're not. Like I said, if they're disrupted twice, they die. Okay? The last thing on these cards is that little symbol between the two A's there, the little skull there. When a leader is in a front line of a battle, for every leader that's there, you start with the French side or whoever has the initiative. And by the way, the scenarios will tell you who has the initiative of the game. That's really just the person that goes first. But what you do is you flip over, each side flips over a card for every leader. If the symbols match, your leader's dead. If the colors match in the middle there, and you'll notice like this red card here has a red skull there, the black card has a black skull. Okay? If the colors match, but the symbols don't, then you go to Hors de Combat. If they're completely different, so if I flip over that card and you flip over that card, the symbols in the middle are different. There's no symbol on the 6. That means nothing happens, which is more common. But if I flip over that and you flip over that, whichever leader we were doing that for would die. And then if the other player had leaders, we'd both flip over cards and compare that again. But all you look at is that middle section right there, but like between the 3s. Those are the cards that drive the game.